Welcome to the Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing video podcast series, hosted by the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is called, What About Your Friends? Allies in the Movement for Racial Equity in Policing, where we will discuss the concept of allyship in the movement for racial equity in policing and offer analysis and observations on how communities came together during the protests of summer 2020. My name is Jordan Crowley-Watts, and I'm your conversation host. I'm a rural Nevada native and an alum of Brigham Young University in Utah. I work in public relations and marketing, and I currently live in Los Angeles, California. We have two great guests today. First, we have Miss Cristina Sinsun Ramirez, a labor activist, co-founder of the Workers' Defense Project and JOLT, an organization that increases the civic participation of Latinos in Texas, and host of the Three Righteous Mamas podcast, where she recently hosted a conversation with Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza on the topic of allyship. Ms. Ramirez, we're happy to have you. Anything that you want to say before we get started?
No, I'm just really excited to be here because I think young people are going to transform this country and make it be what it should be. So I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. We also have Dr. Otis Johnson Jr., who is a social scientist and was the principal investigator in a national study of fatal interactions with police. Dr. Johnson is a leading researcher of social inequality in America and is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Social Policy and STEM Equity at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Johnson, we're grateful for your expertise on this incredibly important matter. What do you hope is going to be the outcome of today's discussion?
Well, thank you, Jordan, and I'm happy to be here. Definitely deepening our understanding of allyship. And also talking about the circumstances that are, I'm not going to say preventing, but definitely challenge the formation of allies and advocates. I think that's a real big hurdle when it comes to police reform.
Thank you. Well, as we mentioned earlier, our two distinguished guests will help us understand how to be an effective ally and those challenges, and why allyship is important in the context of racial equity in policing and the criminal justice system. So last summer, when protests broke out across the nation immediately following the death of George Floyd, Dr. Johnson, could you provide additional context relating to those events and lay the foundation for the need for today's discussion?
Well, certainly the killing of George Floyd and many people, in many communities, by police violence and police intervention is really a pressing social problem. One of my colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, Hetty Lee, and her team estimated that I believe police violence was a top 5. Let me scratch that. My colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, Hetty Lee, discovered in her research that police violence was a top 5 leading cause of death among Black males. So clearly, George Floyd is not alone. And in fact, it's not just limited to African Americans. It's an issue that Latinx communities are dealing with, Indigenous communities are dealing with, and definitely women. So this is something that is a nationwide pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, in fact, that police around the world are killing Black and brown individuals at disproportionate rates. So yes, we need to understand the factors that are leading to those disparities, but then also understand a way forward, like how do we begin the conversation with those that are not in those communities, but definitely have a stake in what happens in those communities, because the only way that we move forward is together. So yes, allyship is really key to understanding the solutions to some of the problems that lead to disproportionate death at the hands of police.
Thank you. And I want to follow up a little bit on something that you said. You said that what happened to Mr. George Floyd was not the first, and it was not necessarily a unique situation. And so I want to ask Ms. Ramirez, what do you think was different about this incident with George Floyd that caused so many people outside of the Black community to come out and protest or otherwise show support?
Sadly, the murder of George Floyd was not the first. We've seen uprisings across this country almost every year over the last several years of young Black, mostly men, being killed, and children, Black children, right? And when young Black men are killed, they get termed, children are called men, whereas when white young men are killed, they're called children. So I just want to recognize that disparity that we've seen as well. But I think that in George Floyd's killing and murder and videotape of him suffocating to death, there was this, I remember just listening to it. I didn't even see the video. It's trauma inducing for people to watch. But there was something in that someone said is when he called out for his dead mother, mama, it was like a call for all the mamas. You could feel that as a mother, whether you are a person of color or not. Someone calling for their mother. I mean, when I heard on the radio, because I heard first about it on NPR, I remember just immediately starting crying because I thought of my own child, right? And my son is Latino, he's mixed race, we're lighter skinned. I know that I am not in our community policed the same way that African-American folks are. And I just oh my God, it was totally gut wrenching. And it made people, because when he called for his mother, we were also looking into his eyes, him breathing his last breaths. And there was something devastating of watching humanity die right in front of us in that way, in a way that connected everyone to that crisis. And I think that's why, sadly, we saw for the first time out of all of these uprisings, we saw more white folks and different communities of color really call to that response and say, it was like a call to action to everyone, right? And you saw people come out that didn't come out before. And there was something just so devastatingly humanizing in that moment that connected to everyone. So, every death and every murder has been a tragedy. But there was something about how George Floyd was killed and how he called out that just reached into people and I think moved our country.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your specific experience. That was actually really touching. And I want to put a name to this concept that you're talking about of people connecting and coming together. So Ms. Ramirez, what is the definition of an ally?
I think ally in this context, right, is about standing with people and trying as best you can to understand their reality, right? An ally, in my mind, doesn't necessarily live your experience, right? But they see something grossly unjust and they want to lend their voice, their support in any way possible to stand next to you and say, I'm here, I bear witness to what I see as tragic and wrong, and we all want it to change. What I do think we have to do with allyship in this context is, Dr. Johnson Jr. said it earlier, is that we all have a stake in it, because this is not just an issue for Black folks or Black men or the poor or people in our communities of color. This is everyone's issue, because when we choose as a society to police people as second-class citizens, as not having the same rights, it impacts all of us. It also even just impacts how we prioritize what we fund in this country. The fact that we are willing to spend more money on incarcerating young communities of color than spending on educating our children is a perverse moral construct. And it happens because we are so willing to dehumanize people through systems of police and criminalization. So to me, that impacts whether you are a person that is primarily policed by the criminal justice system or not. You should care, because that takes away resources from all of our children. Those are all of our babies. Those are all of our investments. Those are all of our future, are everyone's children. And we're acting like it's not happening to us, but it's actually happening to all of us. And the last thing I want to say is, when we dehumanize one community and we racialize things in this country, whether it's healthcare or policing or welfare, that's how the ultra wealthy and the ultra ultra powerful get away with not providing us universal health care. It's how they get away with not providing us safe communities for everyone. It's how they get away with not making sure that our schools are fully funded. When we can dehumanize one sector of our community, it impacts everyone. So allyship is about standing with those that are most impacted, but understanding how it's also connected to your own lived reality.
Great. Dr.
And
Johnson.
I'd like to just chime in here because Christina's hit on an important point about how we're so connected. And it is hugely important that people understand that what happens in these communities end up impacting us as a nation, as people who are inextricably linked in so many different ways. And just that life that you snuff out so soon might be the person who makes then one of the greatest contributions that we'll never realize because, we've dehumanized them to a point where we don't believe their lives matter. And of course, that's what Black Lives Matter is all about, right? The movement that humanity is something that's ours. It's not something that is dispensable. It's definitely not something that should be taken so lightly that we would underinvest, and not only underinvest, but then criminalize what would be, in some cases, normative behavior, especially for children, normative child and adolescent behavior. And sadly, we've put these systems that Christina was mentioning throughout our communities, throughout our schools, to the point where now, we have a school to prison pipeline that I think mirrors a lot of the same overcriminalization of populations of color as we see in the George Floyd and the Breonna Taylors of the world. So we really have what I think is an endemic, systemic, structural problem, and we should just name it structural racism, that animates much of what we're seeing within the carceral state. And allyship then is really important to that. And I love the way Christina defined it. But the one distinction I would make here is I am also interested in advocates moving from allyship to actually advocating. And I think that's what we saw recently with the reaction to the George Floyd murder. Clearly, people were thinking, perhaps I was always an ally, right? Someone who might take it, at least would understand that there's systemic racism and not personally act to further systemic and structural racism. But now we need someone who will take the next step and say, not only will I not further that through my own deeds, but now I'm going to proactively, affirmatively work to end systemic racism, especially in policing. And so I think that's where I would like to see allyship go, and I think we're seeing evidence that it is moving in that direction, that we're moving toward a group of advocates that are willing to take action to bring it into police and justice.
That is a really profound distinction between allyship and advocacy, as you described it. I think there are a lot of people who have the mindset, well, I'm not a racist, and so I, am somehow justified in not being an advocate or speaking out about these problems. I think we also see some people who know and recognize these systemic issues, but they think, well, they got this. I don't need to be actively contributing. So why are allies or advocates, as you put it, needed in this movement for racial equity in policing? Why are allies so important?
If I could just jump in here, the one thing I've noticed about change, and it's not going to happen to you. Change often involves you. And if we are not having conversations in at the kitchen dinner table of white America, in the workplace among white colleagues in predominantly white schools, then there's a sizable percentage of our population that's just not going to be an ally, much less an advocate. So one thing that I always stress is that people who are in positions of privilege, dominant groups within society, need to take up the call and engage their parents, engage their sisters, definitely bring their children up in a way that promotes the humanity of all groups. And so that's where I think, allyship definitely should go and definitely transitions into advocacy, is when white America starts to understand that the change in their community must be driven by them. They must be participants in that change. And, then we can start talking about a broader social transformation and the type of change that we all can feel the need.
Yeah, I agree so much with what Dr. Johnson.
Just call me Otis. You just call me Otis.
That's that doctor. So, you did. I'd make everyone, even including my mama, call me doctor. So, but what I really appreciate too is about the piece on advocacy. And also, I think what's important is that we have to build a multiracial coalition in this country, that these issues are being brought to the forefront because they've impacted a community that has been central to the founding, the creation, the pain and history of this country. But we're not dealing with the past of our pain and how we were created, and it keeps coming out into our present. And look, it's not, Black folks can't get it done on their own in this country. We look at the percentages, we have to step up. Folks in other communities of color, of course, like policing disproportionately impacts the Latino community. We also know there are Black folks in the Latino community. It's an ethnicity, not a race, but Black folks are more impacted as far as like killings by the police, right? Yes. Not exclusively, but more impacted. And we all have to step up, and white folks have a stake in that. Brown folks have a stake in that. AAPI community has a stake in that. But also, to me, the baseline is like, don't kill us, right? Don't kill us. Right. But to me, that's not enough. To me, I really want to see a country that is also willing to tackle the past injustice and how it rears itself in our present. To me, justice is not just killing us, or like, don't kill us, but justice is also looking at the massive inequities that exist within our education system, the massive wealth disparities that exist within communities of color, the Black community, and white Americans. And I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation, to where we get to a place where we talk about things like reparations, where we talk about how we enshrine the right of every person to vote in this country, that it should be a right you are born with and die with, that the fact we take away the right of people that have been incarcerated with a felony, the right to vote, the right to an education, that these are all continued injustices of the past. So I hope, again, like, the conversation is a bare minimum that police should not murder Black and Brown communities disproportionately, or use force to the extent that they do, that we shouldn't invest so heavily in policing at the expense of our schools and education of our children. But let's not stop there. Let's have like a real conversation about what justice, real justice, looks like for all of us and why it benefits everyone. And I would just point out a really great book written by a very good friend of mine, Heather McGee, that just came out. That's The Sum of Us, How Racism, I believe the title is The Sum of Us, How Racism Impacts Us All, or the cost to all of us, right? And she talks about how racism, again, is used as a weapon to not just deny Black folks or brown folks certain access. It's a way to deny then poor people, working class people, middle class people, the right to basic guarantees that we all deserve, but we racialize those things instead of making them about everyone. And the only people that gain when we're divided are the ultra wealthy and the people that are already powerful and have access to everything that we don't as a country, ordinary people.
Thank you. I really appreciate the themes that both of you have brought up about unity and the need for everyone to work together so that all people can live in an equitable society. And so I want to push on that concept a little bit. There was a group of people who had good intentions and who started saying things and posting on social media that came across a little bit tone deaf. They would use the phrase hashtag all lives matter. And it became very clear to people after a short time that that was maybe a form of advocacy or allyship gone wrong. And so why is it that those intentions and those types of responses are not helpful from an advocacy or allyship perspective?
I think that, people have to try and spend I think twofold. One is I believe we have to create space for people to make mistakes. Like, this is a new arena for people sometimes to learn and grow. And I don't care what your background is, you just are learning, and we need to make space, but we also need to make space and make sure that the voices that are directly impacted are being able to live on the forefront of these issues. And when people say all lives matter, the reason people have to say Black Lives Matter in the first place is because it doesn't feel like Black Lives Matter in the same, that they don't carry the same weight or value to the powers that to the criminal justice system, to our political system, to our economic system. And the reality is the data bears that fact, that Black folks and brown folks are incarcerated at greater rates, that they are policed at greater rates, that their schools are underfunded at greater rates, that they are more likely to be denied quality healthcare. I mean, just go down any list. So the data bears it. And so calling out Black lives, I feel like we've come to a place where people now understand that why we say Black Lives Matter, and anyone that's denying to say that, I think for the most part is not really trying to be an ally or an advocate. But I also want to challenge ourselves to allow people to make mistakes, invite people in that may not use the exact right language. I always say that I am the proudest when I'm talking to people that don't use the same language as me, because that means I'm expanding my circle and I'm reaching people that don't think like me. If you're talking to people that all use the same language and talk right, that means you're not doing the work to have the hard conversations. So have the hard conversations, but also do it in a way that's not judgmental, that you really listen to people. I've been an organizer for 20 years, and I've had to have hard conversations with people that were racist, sexist, homophobic. And I always was glad that I was talking to those people because they were getting to learn from me and I was getting to learn from them. And a lot of them moved in a different direction, but it took listening versus judging to get them there.
I'll add all that Christina said. And one point I will make that I think, and this is where I need a little bit of help, and in places where I believe I need to grow. But I often hear the all lives matter as a response to Black Lives Matter. It is not said as something that would actually be said on its own, right? It's always a response. And so when I hear that, there are a few things that I think. First, that this is a challenge to Black Lives Matter, because it would not be said if someone did not say Black Lives Matter. And yes, there might be a visceral response among people to say, okay, clearly they're not on our side, they're not with our agenda. But like Christina, it's here where you have to recognize, okay, there's some conversation that needs to be had. Even though I am not so certain that an individual that would say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter is someone who's going to be convinced at the end of that conversation, right? I'm a skeptic, I'm a cynic, and when it comes to, the actual outcome of engaging. someone, it's almost the same thing as saying Blue Lives Matter in response to Black Lives Matter, which I think is somewhat counterproductive. So if I could make a suggestion to those who believe that all lives matter, is first, try to understand why someone would say a single race like Black lives matters. So they have to be willing to meet us halfway, right? There has to be some openness to understanding why someone would say that. And I am so certain that there are people out there who don't know the data. Christina knows the data. I know the data. I produce the data in many of cases, right?
I'm reading your data.
So I know some people don't have that information. But at the same time, we have to get beyond the ideological gut reaction and hope that there's some willingness to actually hear us. And at that point, then Christina is who they should be listening to, right? Because she has a message, she has the passion, she has the evidence, and that's the conversation that we need to set the stage for if people are willing to meet us halfway. So it's not always what should, and this I think is really the strongest point that we should take from this. The onus is not always on the marginalized to get you ready to receive what needs to be heard. Mm-hmm. We need to demand of the other side too, that they be interested in understanding what needs to be understood. And so again, while I understand the importance of allyship, I don't want our understanding of that construct to be so one-sided that it's our responsibility to imbue others to be effective allies. They have to be willing and meet us halfway in that joint enterprise.
Thank you. Thank you. That is really a thought-provoking concept. How can we all meet each other halfway? And how can people who are interested in being advocates actually take that first step to doing something meaningful, or at least changing their perspective in one way or another? And I think over the last few months, we've seen a really significant educational piece to this movement. I was really kind of amazed because I had a few middle school cousins, they're 12, 13, and they were posting Instagram story graphics about the history of systemic racism in the United States law enforcement. And I was like, what the heck? You guys are 12. Where are you getting this stuff? And on the other side, I've seen some of the older generation who are maybe not as active on social media struggling to keep up with the education piece. They hear new buzzwords, equity versus equality, anti-racist, or even hashtag defund the police, a movement that is still, not fully understood. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So how can someone really stay up to date with all of these concepts and educate themselves appropriately so that they can be effective advocates in the fight for racial equity in policing?
So, I think about it in different ways. I think I think if you're going to be an advocate, it is really important that you take the time to read and learn. And there's one thing that I can say that is just something I appreciate so much is just the incredible amount of memoirs, history books, analysis that have been written by the Black community in this country themselves. I was just literally watching today the new movie that's on HBO about Fred Hampton Jr. that's just beautifully well done, and about his work that made him so dangerous was doing multiracial work and building multiracial coalition work that ultimately led to his murder. But I think that there's so many great books, take the time to learn, take the time to read. The internet is magical and amazing. And then also recognize that we're in a moment where people are developing ideas and terminology. And so, and that's going to be a process. And then for older generation, my mom her first language is not English. So sometimes she doesn't know all the right terms, but she has the right value set. She cares deeply. And so I worry more about my mom understanding how her value set aligns with a policy versus like, did my mom say the right term? Because you know what? She's probably not going to, but that's okay, because at the end of the day, she stands like with the values of the movement and what it means. And so I think that that's really important, is to like focus really on when people's values align, but maybe they're new to the terminology, and really just focusing on that and honoring that they're with you. Because sometimes I think, especially the younger generation, can get really caught up if someone used the right term versus like listening to what they're saying and they're actually with you, and like celebrate that they're with you and then move them along with you.
Dr. Johnson, any thoughts to add to that?
It was, it's such, it is difficult sometimes to decipher what really is the rhetoric of the movement from the spin that we see about the movement, or movements. Don't want to essentialize the movement. And I do think that's a challenge. It's a challenge for, someone like myself who, I understand defund the police to mean many different things. And so I think we do have this kind of this gap between what we hear in the media, on social media, these posts, and what the real tangible policy proposal, what that might be. I don't think that everyone is going to make sense of that. And I do understand that to some degree, rhetoric is proselytizing, right? That you say something in a powerful way and it creates movement. But we know that that's not the policy proposal, right? So I guess I'm complicating things a little bit here, because I don't know that clarity has to be achieved on all of these things in our discourse. What Christina said is most important about the values, right? The fact that we have a common set of principles that should dictate the direction forward. And we can hash out all of the defund versus really eliminate in some cases versus reprioritize funding or redirect funding. There are so many different ways that we can, act, but all of those actions would come from, the same value set. And I think that's what we should be about expanding, right? Bringing more people to our core set of principles, having them believe in racial justice, having them believe in equity, having them understand that sometimes to move forward in principle requires us to adjudicate real, tangible resources. And that we shouldn't be afraid to do so because our values are just that important, right? They're just that important that we achieve and that we pursue. So yes, Christina just hit it on the head there about the core set of values. And I think that's what we need to be promoting going forward, and spending less time on trying to, because it really is it's a wedge when we decide that if you don't say the exact same word, even within, let's say, one side of the movement, if there are sides, it's a way to disempower that movement and make it less effective. So if I'm going to give a little bit of advice to the people that are for justice, is that let's move forward with the core set of values and proselytize, get more people, coalition build, and then we get into the details of what policy proposals we might have.
Those are just powerful responses. I hope that if anything from this conversation that people hear the message that both of you shared, to not be afraid. Don't get so caught up in the micro details and policies, and focus on the principles. I think that's going to be a really life-changing concept to people. I have personally seen some of my friends and family members, they're trying their best to support something that they don't fully understand or empathize with. And we see some people, attack them because they forgot to capitalize B in Black, or they weren't sure if they should say African-American versus Black or something like that. And that fear causes them to be silent and to actually hide behind just the fear of stepping out into something that they're uncomfortable with. So let's talk about
Jordan. I just want to. It's okay to be uncomfortable. I think that's going to be. I mean, Christina, do you agree? Like, if there's rule number one in allyship, it is be prepared to be uncomfortable. So, I wish that a lot of the discomfort that people feel when they engage with people who have a grievance, and really are demanding humanity, equal humanity, if it wasn't taken as an accusation that undermines or that calls into question their own principles and their own humanity, I don't know that the movement will be successful if we're all predisposed to that type of reaction. We're going to have to develop some thicker skin here, and just know that ultimately, I believe you, and that in your core, you're a good person. If you engage me and want to hear my story.
Yeah.
Now, you may not engage me in the best way possible, but the fact that you are engaging me, I immediately think you're a good person. Now we can start working on the details and the mechanics of how we're going to relate to each other's experience. And so I just wanted to interject there. I didn't mean to cut you off. I know you're moving into another area.
No, that's wonderful. Ms. Ramirez, anything that you'd like to add? I saw you nodding and agreeing.
Oh, no, I just agree. I mean, I think the other thing is to realize is that we're all going to be allies in certain moments. Like, there's nothing, you never understand anyone else's experience fully. You understand your own, right? And that's okay. And I love reading and learning. Like, shit, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss. Like, I don't know if I understand myself some days, I'm discover new things about myself as I get older, like about my background, and I learn about myself. So I don't expect my expectation of people. And I guess I would say this, I was recently asked in an interview I did is how I've changed as I've gotten older. And I said, I used to see the world as black and white, like you were either right or wrong, or you were this way or that way. And it was very exacting, but it was also a way as I've gotten older, I've realized the world is more gray, and that people are also contradictory, right? Like, you can have someone that's really, really great on economic justice, but maybe they have some blind spots on the LGBTQ community, or someone's really good on racial justice, but they don't understand immigration, right? And they don't understand how they're connected. We all have blind spots, and our job is to make our movement bigger and invite people in. I'm sometimes worried when I see people making the world smaller and smaller just because they want to hear everyone talk and see the world exactly as they do. I know, Otis, you brought it up, there's different ways that defund the police can mean different things. Let's expand and grow our movement and have healthy debate inside that's from a place of love and values versus from a place of precision and perfection, because the definite thing I promise you will learn as you get older is that there is no perfect, that there's only progress.
Wonderful. That is so insightful. And like I mentioned earlier, I think that's going to be a really reassuring concept for people who've wanted to be involved and yet have had that fear holding them back. Removing that level of perfection and still trying anyway. I think that's such a beautiful concept that both of you have clearly promoted today. So I want to ask, what are some actionable steps that people can take to be advocates in this movement?
Otis, do you want to go first?
Well, there's so many. We've mentioned quite a few. Christina mentioned learning, reading, just trying to educate yourself as best you can about the experiences of the groups that are advocating for change, and then maybe understanding their story, understanding their history, and the current challenge. That, of course, is probably the first step. Of course, preceding that, though, is that you have to be open to the possibility of coming to someone else's cause when it might not, at least in your own mind, directly impact your life and your well-being. So those are two things. But then once you learn something, just know that there's so much more to learn, that you're never going to be totally literate in someone else's experience. So be humble once you do engage with those populations. And again, ask how best you can be an advocate, as opposed to deciding what you think is best for those communities. Beyond that, I would say you can't be an advocate if you're silent. Silence can be acquiescence, right? Could be complicitness, right? So just know that you're now going to have to take action in some way to make known what it is that you stand for and why it's so important. Then last, once you decide, well, not last, I'm sure there are a whole bunch of other things you could do, but then engage people who are like you, meaning people in white communities, white churches, your parents who might say illiberal things from time to time, your kids. Engage them and understand what you're doing when you do that. And I'll just give this example. When you have a child that's raised in a white neighborhood, white schools, and is basically taught to fear going to Black neighborhoods and that the Black schools are not good schools, then that child grows up and they end up getting a job as a police officer in that Black neighborhood or that Black school. What we've done in that is failed, because that person is already primed, socialized, and acting with these beliefs that have been enshrined in them for decades. And so if we don't deal with what's happening in our own schools, our own neighborhoods, our own churches, with our own kids, then that's what's going to happen. We're going to end up raising the next generation of haters, just like we have now, that then go on to become police officers in our neighborhoods and schools.
Oh, I love that. I love that, Otis. Thank you for that. Especially, I'm going to talk about my son in a little bit, but I would agree, like everything Otis said, right? And obviously Otis is very well-versed because this is like his life, his study. But I think there's 3 very simple things that people can do. Is one, read. And I want to give my 3 top favorite books. One is The New Jim Crow, which a lot of people know, which I think is a brilliant book. Last Man Standing. And it's by Geronimo. It's about a biography of Geronimo Pratt, Black Panther that was incarcerated for 27 years. He was at that time the longest incarcerated political prisoner, and was found to have been falsely incarcerated intentionally. And the FBI actually had to pay restitution for, drumming up false evidence that led to his conviction. And I'll say my dad, my white dad, made me read it when I went to jail for 3 days, and I was crying about how terrible the treatment was when I was like 19 because I had gotten arrested at a protest. And I was crying. And I told my dad that they even held me in solitary confinement. He just laughed at me and he said, "You're a privileged kid. You better read this book and then come talk to me about what the criminal justice system actually looks like." So I read it and it like blew my mind, and it was a great book. So it's like my top book I always recommend. And then
you have a great dad too.
I have a great dad. He made me read his biography in middle school. So like I have a great dad, a great white dad. So great white dads can be great. And then The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. The last thing is there's so much stuff happening at council level. And don't worry about the term defund the police, because if it makes you uncomfortable, because there's a lot of people it makes uncomfortable, but polling wise, when people ask, like, do you think we should spend more money on mental health services, more on schools instead of policing? Nearly everybody says yes. Like everyone wants those things because it's our value set that says we want to invest in our kids instead of incarcerating people. So we all agree on that for the most part. 90% of America agrees on that value set roughly. So get involved in your city council where they're having these debates. You don't have to use the right language, but you know your values that, yeah, we want to spend more money on our children and our communities than we do on putting people behind bars. And the last thing, I think what Otis said really moved me about the relationships you have. You know, I have this podcast with these two other moms, one's Muslim, one's queer, and then myself, Latina. And what we realize is like at the end of the day, people might look at us and think it's weird that we're all friends, but we all care and want the same things. And I learned from my friend Muna, who's Muslim on the show, they have this saying from the Quran that the first school for a child is on his mother's lap. And so like we have so much power in the relationships we have. The greatest influence we're going to have is not on social media. It's the face-to-face conversations we have. And the thing I want to teach Santi is what I think we should all walk away with, which is what Otis said, is to not be complicit. Like most of us are not going to be bullies. Most of us are not going to be the one shouting, saying, oh, Black lives don't matter, right? But most people will sit on the sidelines and say nothing. I want to teach Santi that it's not enough to not just be the bully or be bullied. I don't want you to sit on the sidelines when you see something that's wrong or unjust. Like, let's teach each other that's really the value set of what change and allyship looks like. It's choosing not to be silent when it has a cost to you.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing such clear and actionable steps that people can take in their journeys to becoming advocates. We're coming to the close of our time together. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say about this concept of allyship advocacy in racial equity for policing?
I would just say that it's a wonderful conversation. It's a necessary conversation. I'm kind of heartbroken with what happened January 6th. And it's clear that if we do not make more allies and more advocates, that will be our national reality. So I just want to say that I can't stress the importance of these conversations, as Christina mentioned, in this relationship building enough, that our future really depends on our ability to do so.
And I just want to thank first you, Jordan, and the team that past to make a better future. And I want to thank, I'm going to say Dr. Johnson, for all of his research and dedicating his life to trying to uplift and tell these stories through really critical research. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you both, Ms. Ramirez and Dr. Johnson, for joining us on this episode of Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing. I think it's clear that you don't have to be a social scientist or an activist to make a difference and to start today to be an advocate for racial equity in policing and for humanity. Thank you both for your inspiring examples.